Okay, a couple of things that are important as you get started with watercolor are the paper, the brush, and the watercolors. Super important. 140-pound, 100% cotton cold press paper is what I like to use. And I use a variety of watercolors, but Winsor Newton is my favorite. And I've begun to use the Professional series, but you can use any watercolors. I do suggest buying a Winsor Newton set or a higher quality set, but it doesn't have to be the Professionals. Okay, so we're gonna do a couple of different things. First of all, take your dry brush, dip it in the water, and get a pretty good amount of water on the brush. We're gonna first do water and then paint. So my brush is pretty full of water. I don't think you can see from there, but it's dripping off the end, and that's okay because of what we're gonna do. Typically, you don't want the water dripping off the end of the brush. We're just gonna brush a little bit of water onto the paper. And we're gonna spread it out a little bit because I don't want the water pooling on the paper, but I want to see the shininess of the paper from the watercolor. And then I'm gonna take this blue because it's really deep and rich and fun to see. So I'm just going to, I took my wet brush and I dabbed it into the dry watercolor that I've already put into, I've taken it from the tubes and put it into my palette, but you can also just take it off of the half pans. You need a little bit more water to loosen up the paint on the half pans. So my paper is still wet. I've got paint on the tip of the brush, a lot of paint, and I'm just gonna tap it here. And you see what it does. It just spreads. You can see it kind of growing into the water. Okay, so now I've still got paint in my brush, and I'm gonna paint over here on a piece of the paper that doesn't have any water on it. And you can just see what it turns out like. So it's a little bit dry because I haven't put it back in, and it doesn't do a complete fill in of the color on the paper, but that's okay. This is just an example that we're showing. So I'm gonna dip in a little bit more water, and I'm gonna dip into my paint one more time, and I'm gonna get even more paint on my brush. As you can see, I'm getting quite a bit. And then you can begin to do some shapes if you want. This is just gonna be a simple little rose. Just start out with a couple of little swatches. You're doing them in circular motions. Start with the tip of the brush. Tip of the brush, flatten out the brush. Kind of swirl it out. Then I'm going to dip the brush back in the water, clean off some of that paint, and then take the brush and hit the sides of my jar to take some of that water off. And I'm going to tap on the paper and swirl around. Do it again. A little bit more water. I dab it in the water, wipe it on the edge of the jar. Got quite a bit of water on here. Now I want basically a clean brush for this last stroke. And because I'm touching my brush on the edges of the flower, it's bringing some of that water into it. Okay, so we're going to do that again. This time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wake up, I guess, my half pan watercolors. You can do it either with a spray bottle, which is pretty handy to do and doesn't require you to dip your brush in the water and wet each one individually. So they're all pretty wet, as you can see. My brush is also wet. I always dip my brush in the water and tap it off a little bit. Okay, so let's try a red. I'm getting quite a bit of watercolor onto the brush, as you can see. And then I always, so you want the brush full of watercolor. See, so what you want is a fully wet brush and then a brush full of paint. So get the brush completely wet in the water and then put it into your watercolor and dab it around until the brush is full. You want the belly of the brush to be completely full of watercolor. So my brush is full and the paint is not dripping off the brush. And you can see when I do a stroke, it's a nice full stroke. Let me show you what this looks like with a little bit more water in it. So I'm going to take this brush, I'm not going to put it in the paint at all. I'm going to dip it in the water one time, and I'm going to wipe the edge of the brush on the jar and bring it back over here. You can see it's still pretty full of both, but there's a little bit more water. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a little bit more opacity to this stroke. Put it in the water again, dab the end of the brush even more. Let me bring the water over here. So I always use 1 jar of clean and 1 jar of dirty water. And so I don't normally set this on my paper, but for the sake of this video I'm doing for you, that's what I'm doing. So I dip the brush that has paint in it into the dirty water, pull it out, wipe it on the edge, and then stroke it on my paper. Even more opacity. One more time. Dip it in, wipe it on the edge of the jar, brush. Dip it in, wipe it on the edge of the jar, brush. It's getting lighter each time we go. Okay?